carried the weight of confession for 38 years, and I have never once spoken these words aloud, not to my wife before she passed, not in the quiet moments when she would hold my hand and ask what haunted me, not to my children, who grew old wondering why their father never smiled, why he would sit for hours staring at nothing, why he flinched at the sound of church bells. Not to any living priest in any church that would have me, though I stood outside their doors more times than I can count, my hand on the iron handle, unable to turn it. There are sins so deep that even silence cannot bury them, and there are confessions that should never be heard by mortal ears. I know this now. I learned it in the summer of 1886, in a crumbling adobe mission outside Las Cruces, New Mexico, where I knelt before a man who had been dead for 7 years. I was a cattle driver then, moving herds north from Texas through the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man, a stretch of desert so barren it seemed God himself had turned his face from it. The name was not an exaggeration. Men died out there regularly, their bodies found weeks later, mummified by the heat, picked clean by vultures. The sun was relentless, the water scarce, and the land stretched on forever in all directions, flat and colorless and infinite. The work was hard, but it was honest, and for a time I believed that honest work could scrub a man clean of his past. I believed that if I drove enough cattle, slept enough nights under the stars, earned enough calluses on my hands, I could somehow balance the scales. I was wrong. The thing I had done, the choice I had made 3 years prior in a town called Piedras Negras, a town I will never return to, followed me like a shadow that grew longer with every mile. I had killed a man. Not in self-defense, not in war, not in any circumstance that could be justified or forgiven. I had killed him for money, shot him in the back while he knelt in prayer in his own home, and I had taken the $50 his widow kept hidden in a jar beneath the floorboards. His name was Thomas Garrett. He was a school teacher. He had 3 children. I told myself it was necessity. I told myself I had no choice, that my own family was starving, that the world had left me no other option. But the truth I could not escape no matter how many miles I put between myself and that town, was that I had become something less than human, and I knew it. By the summer of 1886, I could no longer sleep. When I closed my eyes, I saw his face turning toward me in that final second, the confusion and the terror, the betrayal of a man who had done nothing but trust in the sanctity of his own 4 walls. I heard the shot, louder than any thunder, echoing in my skull. I felt the weight of the revolver in my hand, still warm, still smoking. I tasted the dust I kicked up running from that house, the grit between my teeth, the bile rising in my throat. The other drovers noticed. They saw the way my hands shook when I tried to roll tobacco, the way I would sit apart from the campfire at night, staring into the darkness. They heard me talking in my sleep, begging for forgiveness from someone who would never answer, calling out names they did not recognize. One of them, an old Mexican vaquero named Esteban, pulled me aside one evening as we made camp near the Rio Grande. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and copper, and the river moved slow and brown beside us. He looked at me with eyes that had seen more than mine ever would, eyes that had watched men die, and borders shift and whole ways of life disappear. And he said, "You carry death on you, amigo. I can smell it. It is in your sweat, in your breath. You need to confess, or it will eat you from the inside like a sickness. I laughed at him, a brittle, hollow sound. I told him I had no use for priests or churches, that I had left that superstition behind in childhood, along with my belief in saints and miracles. But he shook his head slowly, and he told me about a place, a small mission, he said, about 15 miles west of the trail, abandoned by the church but still standing. He said there was a priest there, an old man who heard confessions even though the mission had been closed for years. He said the priest asked no questions, demanded no penance, required no acts of contrition, only listened. And Esteban said, with a look I will never forget, a look of profound sadness and something close to pity, that sometimes a man needs to speak his sin aloud, even if no absolution follows, even if God himself has stopped listening. He said the place was called San Miguel de los Penitentes, Saint Michael of the Penitents, and that I would find it if I was meant to. I should have known better. I should have heard the warning in his voice, the hesitation, the way he would not meet my eyes when he spoke of it. I should have asked him why he knew about this place, why he spoke of it with such certainty and such sorrow. But desperation makes fools of us all, and I was drowning in mine. 2 days later, I told the trail boss I needed to leave for personal business. He did not argue. He had seen the same thing Esteban had seen, the mark of death, the stain that would not wash away. He probably thought I was going to put a bullet in my own head, and maybe he was relieved to be rid of me, one less troubled soul to worry about. I took my horse, a canteen, my revolver, and my guilt, and I rode west into the desert as the sun began its descent. The land out there is not like the green hills of Kentucky where I was raised, where the earth is soft and the rain comes regular and the trees grow thick enough to block out the sky. This was a place of stone and thorn and wind, a place where the earth cracks open under the heat, and nothing grows but sparse creosote and the occasional lonely yucca, their blades sharp as knives. The sky was cloudless, pale and merciless, stretched tight like canvas over the world. The heat rose in shimmering waves that made the horizon dance and blur, made the distant mountains seem to float, made reality itself feel uncertain. I rode for hours, following Esteban's directions, until I saw it in the distance, a low structure of adobe brick, its walls the same dull brown as the desert itself, crumbling at the edges, its wooden cross tilted and weathered, its single bell tower empty and silent against the dying light. There were no other buildings nearby, no village, no cemetery that I could see, though I looked. Just the mission, alone in the vastness, as if it had been forgotten by time itself, left behind when the world moved on. I dismounted and tied my horse to a post that looked like it might crumble to dust at any moment. The air was utterly still, no birds, no insects, no rustle of wind through grass because there was no grass, just the faint whisper of air moving through the empty bell tower, a low mournful sound like a breath exhaled. The front door was open, hanging crooked on rusted hinges, and I stepped inside. The interior was cool and dim, a relief from the brutal sun that had beaten down on me all afternoon. The walls were thick, maybe 3 feet of packed earth and straw, the windows small and set high, letting in only narrow beams of golden light that cut through the shadows like blades. There were wooden pews, maybe a dozen of them, worn smooth by generations of hands and knees, scarred with the carvings of names and dates I could not read in the dimness. The altar was simple, a table covered with a faded cloth that might once have been white but was now the color of old bone. A wooden crucifix hanging above it, Christ's face smooth and featureless from age. Candles sat in iron holders along the walls, their wax melted into strange twisted shapes, rivers of tallow frozen mid-flow, but none of them were lit. The smell was old, dust and damp earth and something else, something faintly sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in a vase or fruit gone bad in the heat. I stood there in the doorway, and for a moment I considered leaving. Every instinct I had told me to turn around, to mount my horse, to ride back to the living world. But then I heard it, a voice, low and steady, speaking in Latin. I turned toward the confessional booth on the left side of the chapel, near the back wall. It was a simple structure, dark wood that looked almost black in the shadows. 2 doors with faded red curtains hanging inside. The voice was coming from within, rhythmic and calm, the cadence of prayer, words I did not understand but recognized from childhood masses. I felt my heart begin to beat faster. I had not expected the priest to actually be there. Part of me had thought the mission would be empty, that Esteban had sent me on a fool's errand, that I would kneel before an empty booth and speak my sins to nothing and find some small measure of peace in the act alone. But here he was. Here was the man who would hear my confession. I walked toward the booth, my boots echoing on the stone floor, each step impossibly loud in the silence. I pulled aside the curtain, the fabric rough and stiff beneath my fingers, and I knelt in the small cramped space. The wood was cold against my knees despite the warmth of the day. There was a screen between me and the other side, a lattice of carved wood so dark I could barely see through it, just the vague outline of a figure seated in shadow. The voice stopped. There was silence, heavy and waiting, pressing against my ears. And then he spoke. "You have come to confess." It was not a question. His voice was dry, thin, like wind through dead grass, like paper crumbling, like something that should not be speaking at all. I could not see his face clearly through the screen, only the vague outline of a figure seated perfectly still. I swallowed hard, my throat tight, and I said yes. "Yes, Father, I had come to confess." "Then speak," he said. "Speak your sin and unburden your soul before the eyes of God." And so I did. I told him everything. I told him about Thomas Garrett, about the way he knelt beside his bed every night to pray, about the sound the floorboards made when I crept up behind him. I told him about the $50, about how little it was, how pathetic, how I had sold my soul for less than a month's wages. I told him about the nights I could not sleep, the sound of the gunshot that followed me everywhere, the faces of my own children looking at me and seeing a stranger, seeing something cold and broken. I told him about the lies I had told my wife, about the way I could not bear her touch because I did not deserve it. I spoke for what felt like hours, my voice cracking, my hands gripping my knees until my knuckles went white, my breath coming in shallow gasps. And he listened. He did not interrupt. He did not gasp or condemn or offer comfort. He only listened, silent and still as stone, until I had nothing left to say, until I was hollow and empty. When I finished, there was a long pause. I could hear my own heartbeat. I could hear the wind outside moving through the bell tower. And then he said, very quietly, almost gently, "Your sin is heavy. It will not leave you." I felt a chill run through me despite the warmth of the chapel, a cold that started deep in my chest and spread through my limbs. I asked him, my voice barely a whisper, what I should do, what penance could wash this away. How many prayers, how many years? "There is no penance," he said. "There is only the carrying." I did not understand. I leaned closer to the screen, trying to see his face, trying to understand, and I asked him again, "Please, Father, tell me what I must do. Give me something, anything. You must carry it." He repeated, his voice unchanging, patient, almost kind, "As I carry mine." And then he leaned forward, just slightly, and the light from one of the high windows caught his face through the lattice. I will remember that sight until the day I die, and perhaps longer, perhaps forever. Perhaps it will follow me into whatever waits beyond. His skin was the color of old leather, stretched tight over bone, sunken and hollow and wrong. His eyes were not eyes at all, but dark empty sockets, dry and lifeless, filled with shadow. His lips were pulled back in a grimace that might have been a smile, or might have been pain, exposing yellowed teeth, some of them missing, the gums black. His hands, resting on the armrest of his seat, were skeletal, the flesh withered and black, the bones visible through papery skin. He was not alive. He had not been alive for a very long time. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My throat closed, my lungs seized. I scrambled backward, falling out of the confessional, my legs tangling beneath me, my shoulder hitting the edge of the door. I hit the stone floor hard, the impact jarring my bones, rattling my teeth, and I looked back at the booth. The curtain swayed gently, as if moved by a breeze, but there was no breeze. The chapel was silent, no footsteps, no movement, nothing. I got to my feet, shaking so badly I could barely stand, and I ran. I threw open the door and stumbled out into the blinding sunlight, the heat hitting me like a physical blow, my breath coming in ragged gasps that burned my throat. My horse was still there, standing calm and unbothered, as if nothing had happened, as if the world had not just tilted on its axis. I untied it with trembling hands, my fingers fumbling with the knot, and I climbed into the saddle, kicking it into a gallop before I even had my bearings. I rode east, back toward the trail, back toward the living world, and I did not look back, not once. I was afraid of what I might see. It was only later, when I reached the camp as the sun was setting, and Esteban saw my face, saw the wildness in my eyes, the way I was shaking, that I learned the truth. He sat me down by the fire, pressed a tin cup of whiskey into my hands, and he told me that the mission had been abandoned in 1879, 7 years before. He told me that the priest who had served there, a man named Father Dominguez, had hanged himself in the bell tower after hearing the confession of a dying outlaw, a man who had committed such terrible sins, sins so dark and unspeakable that the weight of them had broken the priest's faith entirely. They had found Father Dominguez 3 days later, his body swaying in the wind, his face frozen in an expression of unspeakable sorrow, his hands still clutching the rope. They had buried him in the desert, unmarked, unsanctified, because the church would not consecrate the grave of a suicide, would not allow him rest in holy ground. I asked Esteban why he had sent me there, why he had told me to confess to a dead man, what he thought would happen. He looked at me for a long time, the firelight playing across his weathered face, and then he said, "Because some sins are too great for the living to hear. They break us, they poison us, and some of us, we are already damned, already beyond saving. The dead, they understand, they do not judge, they only witness." I left the cattle drive that night. I rode north, and I never returned to New Mexico. I married a woman who asked me no questions about my past. I had children. I built a life that looked from the outside like redemption, like a man who had turned away from darkness. But I have never been free. I carry the weight of that confession still, just as Father Dominguez told me I would. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the wind moves through the trees outside my window, I hear his voice again, dry and thin and patient, whispering the same words over and over. There is no penance. There is only the carrying. I do not know if I spoke to a ghost or to something darker, or to the hollow echo of my own guilt given shape and voice. But I know this. I confessed my sins to a priest who died years earlier, and he heard me. And in hearing me, he bound me to them forever. There is no washing away what I have done. There is no forgiveness waiting. There is only the weight and the carrying and the knowledge that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Some frontiers were never meant to be crossed. Some confessions should never be spoken. And some men, no matter how far they run, will never escape what they have done.